We need to talk about whole. Transfeminism, film, bodily autonomy, editing, anime. Wait, anime? Yes, anime. Utena? Yeah, Utena. But more importantly, whole. Okay, cut. Is the real me ready? Can we get her in here? Yeah, no, don't worry. It's just, you know, to warm up the audience a little bit. So you're trying to censor me? No one's trying to censor you. You don't want me to talk about whole? No, we all want you to talk about whole. I love when you talk about whole. I could listen to you talk about whole for days. I mean... sir, the real me's ready. Oh, she's ready? Okay, great. You can just take a seat right there on that chair. Holes! I need holes! So, tell us a little bit about yourself. So, I'm going to talk about my ancestry and where I'm filming this from. The idea of territory acknowledgements comes from Indigenous scholars and activists, and in my own life, I feel like I really learned the value and importance of these things from my professor, Dr. Christine C. I feel like in her classes I really learned that gender is a tool of colonialism, and so we can't have any conversation about transliberation or transfeminism without also necessarily talking about decolonization. So I have largely Scottish, Irish, and British ancestry, and I'm filming this as an uninvited settler on the stolen lands of the Lekwungen and Wasanich peoples. I'm going to put in the top of the description box below some Indigenous causes around me that you can give financial support to, as well as a link to the website nativeland.ca. It was created by a group of Indigenous activists to help settlers recognize whose ancestral lands they are living on. I want to urge everyone who's watching this video to think about your own relationship to the land that you're on, and what you're doing to support the land and the Indigenous peoples of that land. Nativeland.ca is a great tool for starting that process because they usually link to the websites of the nations in a given area, so settlers can start to educate themselves on how to support that nation. Down below, I'm also going to list a number of my favorite media made by Indigenous artists. Out of that list, I want to recommend two in particular that I think are especially relevant to what I'm talking about today in terms of non-normative editing. The first is nîtisânak by Cree Métis Saulteaux author Jas M. And it's a memoir about their life growing up as a queer, trans, Indigenous punk on the prairies, and the way that they write genuinely changed my whole perspective on writing memoir, so I can't praise that book highly enough. The second is a short film by a Hunkpapa Lakota filmmaker, Dana Claxton, called I Want to Know Why. I don't want to spoil that film or my own, but if you get to part 6 of this video and you think to yourself, that's a really interesting technique being used with static, I highly, highly recommend checking out I Want to Know Why.
Is it time for me to talk about my Utena trans theory yet?
Okay, 1, you're not supposed to be here yet. 2, are you trying to say that Utena's trans?
Duh, of course she is.
That's not what this is about. Are you trying to say that Utena's director, Ikuhara, is trans? No. Listen, queerness isn't about who you're in relationships with, it's about how you're in relationships with. That means that queerness is a particular political agenda, not some kind of party that you're invited to or uninvited from based on what you choose to do with your body and the bodies of other consenting adults. So Ikuhara identifying as a cishet man doesn't change the fact that his body of work is queer, is trans, is intersex. I don't think it's even possible to separate the art from the artist, and that's not what I'm trying to do here today, but I want to emphasize that the body I'm analyzing is not his, it's his works. I also want to make it abundantly clear that no part of this essay is saying Ikuhara is a perfect person, or that Utena is a perfect series. Throughout the anime, the Desi characters Akio and Anthy have a very inconsistent skin tone, hair color, and hair texture. Even considering these inconsistencies, it's clear in the film I'm analyzing that both Anthy and Akio's skin tones were lightened, their hair texture made more straight and fine than their original design. There's no excuse for this. It's blatant whitewashing. And as a fandom, it's something that we need to have more discussions about, and holds Ikuhara and the rest of the Beboppa's team accountable for. In a Tumblr post by Fagdyke Friendship, he writes on race in the Utena series based on their experiences as a Bangladeshi American. I'll preface this by saying yes, Ragu is a Japanese anime, so I would assume all the characters other than Akio and Anthy are meant to be racially East Asian rather than white. However, the treatment of East Asians versus the treatment of Desis in a racial context is quite different. I think the curry episode is a good example of this. Even though I do find it outdated, it is a good way to see the difference in perception between East and South Asia. East Asia is seen in the eyes of whiteness as technologically advanced, while South Asia is seen as uncivilized and third world. Asians across Asia receive different treatment and are discriminated against in different ways. Ikuhara and Utena both deserve recognition for their intersectional analysis of gender, but the last thing I want is for you to leave this video thinking that that analysis is perfect, unproblematic, and unbiased. The same thing goes for my analysis. When I read films, I'm reading them from my body, from my lived experience. That means that all of my analysis becomes true for me only because I believe in it. A big part of this is also naming the fact that I am not the target audience of the film I'm analyzing. It was made before I was born, in a language I don't speak, in a country I've never been to, in a culture I have no connection with, by a group of people I have never met. So I know that there is going to be a lot missing from my analysis because I have such a huge disconnect from the original context under which it was made. All of that to say, I am not here to talk about people's identities, and I'm not here to give you the way to read movies or the way to read Utena. All I'm here to ask is, what if? What if we started to think about films as subjects instead of objects? What if we started saying that a work of art has a transfeminist method? What possibilities would be opened by thinking about that?
So, be honest with me. Do you really think Utena's cis?
I never said that. I actually think she's trans in, every direction at once. You know what I mean? You know, when I was a kid, 5 years old, my dad took me to the movie theater for the first time, and I saw Indiana Jones 7. Indiana Jones 7 wasn't out at that time, I know, but I saw it. I saw it in my head. And I said to myself, I'm going to grow up, and I'm going to direct Indiana Jones 7. And now I'm here in this, I don't even know where, and I'm directing these gay Oh, lunchtime's over? Okay. Quiet on set. Yeah, so just take that from, the entire history of photography and film, but, if you could make it quick, because we're kind of running behind schedule, that would be great. Right. So, since the invention of photography, the medium has been a way of producing hate and encouraging violence. As Michelle Pearson Clark wrote in her essay, A Dark Horse in Low Light, photography was deployed to document the scientific fact of racial difference, painting blackness as deviant, criminal, and primitive through the lynching postcard, eugenicist archive, and the criminal mugshot. Similarly, Europeans used the camera to legitimize and justify the social order present in colonization and slavery, producing images of colonial subjects that stereotyped them as barbaric and bizarre. Clark references the writings of Bell Hooks, who says from slavery on, white supremacists have recognized that control over images is central to the maintenance of any system of racial domination. As photography evolved into film, movies didn't really become a mainstream form of entertainment until the invention of the filmic cut, which allowed the medium to move through time in the same way that novels or radio plays could. One of the earliest uses of the filmic cut was associated with the cut trans body, but it wasn't depicting this cut as a positive thing. Although not as strategically deployed as photography was against black and brown bodies, the intent with film was the same, to present the image of the white cis body as right and good, and every other kind of body as dangerous and disposable. One of the first films that really solidified this connection between the filmic cut and the cut trans body was directed by D.W. Griffith. If you've heard of him, it's probably from Birth of a Nation, his 1915 silent film that was significant in carrying anti-black racism from the photograph to the screen. Griffith's legacy is producing and reproducing white supremacy, so it's no surprise that he was also the first person to visually link the filmic cut with the cut trans body, depicting both as deceptive, violent, and unnatural.
The story is of Judith of Bethulia, who's a good Jewish woman who lives in Jerusalem. Then the invading army is coming, and Judith, to save the city, she takes a sword and cuts his head off. There's a claim that this is one of the first films that we know of where the cut in the film is used to advance the story. And there's a kind of like trans or, gender non-binary character who is kind of circulating around the cut in the narrative. It's almost like the figure of the cut trans body, the eunuch who's been castrated or emasculated, who is a cut figure, presides over the invention of the cinematic cut.
Is it whole time yet? Don't mind her. So where does that history leave us today?
I'm so glad you asked. Today, good editing is often described as being invisible, clean, sleek, smooth, tight, and on the other hand, bad editing is often described as being visible, chunky, loose, sprawling, and not to mention distasteful, for reminding the audience that they are in fact an audience. Good editing produces films that act like the idealized female body in the colonial Western context. Bad editing produces films that act like the society's definition of a bad body. I don't want to call all badly edited films transfeminist, or lump together all of the different marginalized groups that are each considered to have their own bad body. I want to call in those films that particularly emphasize the edit as one form of exerting bodily autonomy, in the same way that trans medicine, like HRT or surgery, can be seen as one form of trans liberation. As an example of bad editing, critics claimed that the 2015 film Tangerine was an example of taking a gimmick too far. Sean Baker's film focused around the lives of two trans women of color and was shot on an iPhone instead of the traditional 35mm film, or a digital camera. In her essay analyzing the film, Megan Malone writes, "Tangerine prompts audiences to notice the elements of production and question the reality of what they are seeing. Baker draws back the curtains on filmmaking as a whole, inviting audiences to think about how all of the images they're being fed are plastic. None of them are more real than any others. Mainstream film just tries to present themselves as being more realistic, natural, or believable. Both the institutions of medicine and film have been forced upon trans, intersex, and people of color, historically and presently, but in Tangerine we can see how these two characters are strategically engaging with these institutions as it serves their personal liberation."
Okay, so mainstream films try to make their cuts invisible so that they pass as natural to the audience. But, sorry, can you pick it back up from the transfeminism part?
Sorry, where?
Just like, okay, let's do a little role-playing. Let's get a little bit silly here. Pretend that I'm a baby and you're explaining transfeminism to me.
But I'm baby.
So hard to get good help these days.
Hi there. Is this... Great. So I'm directing this video essay, but I've kind of hit a wall because I realized that I actually know nothing about transfeminism, or okay, like maybe not nothing, but like very, very little. Most of it comes from my professor, Chase Joint, and the lectures that he does with you. So I was thinking you might be able to... Sorry, could you hold for just 1 minute? I already interviewed her. Wait, what? Yeah. Without my permission? Yeah. Without even telling me? Yeah. What did you even say? I watched this movie, and it's called Adolescence of Utena, and I was like, wow, this is like really weird, and I don't get it. And then I watched it another time, and I was like, okay, this is like starting to kind of make more sense. I know that I like it, but I don't know why. And then I watched it like 5 more times, and then I was like, oh my god, this is the best movie ever made! Okay. Hi there. Thanks for waiting. So, if you had somebody call you, Zoom you the other day, just like forget that happened, okay? Let's take it from introductions.
I am Meagan M. Page. I am a writer, artist, and historian from Canada, but I live in London, England, in the UK. I'm the host of the podcast One from the Vaults that brings you all the dirt, gossip, and glamour from trans history, and also the co-writer of the feature film Framing Agnes, directed by Chase Joint, with whom I also wrote the book Boys Don't Cry, which is a history and analysis of the film of the same name and the sort of history of transmasculine cinema.
Amazing. Okay, now, because apparently no one else here can answer this question, what's transfeminism? What's it all about? What's its core tenets? What's its beliefs? Who is she? Why is she?
Transfeminism starts from the idea that women are people and are an oppressed class, but then adds that all gender dissidents are also an oppressed gender class. Another sort of core tenet of transfeminism is that the body is malleable, and while changing the body is not outside the influence of social factors like desirability, whiteness, class, etc., patriarchy. Transfeminism embraces the idea that changing the body, even when it's happening within these systems that we can't get outside of necessarily, is not a anti-feminist act, and in fact is a sort of shape-shifting that has the potential to undo the primary foundations of patriarchy. From a transfeminist perspective, patriarchy relies on the idea that these gender roles are born and inherent. It relies on the idea that the reason women are oppressed is biological. And trans people of all genders undermine that assumption, because if I can change my outward appearance to be in line with how I feel, or even just in general, and thus get treated differently, even though my birth assignment has not changed, then it shows the lie of patriarchy. It shows that actually there's no reason for us to be treating women or other gender dissidents as inferior to cis men. And it also undermines a lot of the violences that are done to cis men as well within patriarchy, right? No one gets out alive from patriarchy. It kills all of us eventually.
So is there any kind of basis for transfeminism as a filmmaking method?
I would say, this is my claim, and it's no surprise to anyone who knows me that I would claim such a thing, but my claim is that the first transfeminist filmmaker is Mira Ross, who emerges in the early 90s, actually in the late 80s, making some of the earliest like transfeminist video art and short films. With Trembling Flesh, she is editing onto and through her body. A camera slowly panning over Mira's naked body, while onto her body are projected natural phenomena like tornadoes and lightning and things like this. And then she's kind of being like very quite tenderly caressed by her partner, Mark. I think that is such a fascinating sight for thinking about the edit of the trans body, of surgery, and in particular in this film, the relationship to nature or unnatural.
Now, in this essay, I'm referencing a lot of papers that I have access to through my university login, but Trembling Flesh is the only source I'm talking about today that I actually had to go and talk to somebody to access. You basically have to send these folks at VTape an email saying that you're a researcher and they'll let you watch it. But because it's not something that's publicly available online, I don't really feel comfortable sharing it on screen here. I highly, highly recommend watching it though, as well as the rest of Mira Soleros's work that's available through VTape. But what I can show and talk about is another director Morgan recommended, Isabel Sandoval. In her 2019 film Lingua Franca, there's a scene that's very reminiscent of Trembling Flesh. Again, a trans woman is very tenderly caressed by her partner while she edits through and onto her body. There aren't any thunderstorms or volcanoes projected onto her, but Sandoval does overlay the images of her body and her partner's. In Trembling Flesh and Lingua Franca, we can see there's a similar move being made to visibilize the edit, and it's no coincidence that this highly stylized form was chosen for scenes when these trans women are feeling empowered in their bodies. On the contrary, these films are empowering them through and because of the edit. Rather than imagining the filmic cut as a euphemism for the cut trans body, Ross and Sandoval show the edit as the mode through which they access themselves, their bodies, and their sexualities. Particularly in the case of Lingua Franca, because this scene takes place in the character's fantasy, the edit is a way for her to imagine all the possibilities of what could be. Okay, cut! That was great! That was great work, everybody! We're only 6 months overdue, that's fine, we'll just get her edited quickly, get her out of here. We're not done filming yet, though. What? You forgot about my hole that quickly. How do you keep getting back in here? I'll never tell. But seriously though, we haven't even started talking about Utena. Who's Utena? Oh, we're back? Okay. With the mystical sword, Utena duels her classmates to protect her strange friend Anthy, who is the key to a magical power that everyone wants and can make Utena's dream to become a prince come true. But their deepening friendship hides a terrible secret, and Utena must face the truth about herself and those she loves, and learn what it truly means to be a hero. I don't know who wrote this synopsis, but either they thought it was really funny to call lesbian relationships strange friendships, or they've never seen this movie in their life. So in order to tell you what the actual plot of Utena is, we need to go on a little field trip back in time. POV, we're in Japan. It's 1995. Ikuhara is the primary director for one of the most popular anime series of all time, Sailor Moon. Ikuhara pitches a film to the production studio, Toei, and this film actually has nothing to do with Sailor Moon, and everything to do with the lesbian couple in the show. And Toei is like, no. So Ikuhara is like, okay, fine then. And he gets together a bunch of the people he worked with on Sailor Moon, and he gets together the money he made from Sailor Moon, and he creates his own studio so that he can finally make anime about lesbians. In all seriousness, there were obviously a lot of other factors involved with this, and while Utena has really become known for its queer representation and intersectional analysis of gender, it has so much to say about so many different topics, and I feel like it's really unfair to everyone who worked on the show to limit it to just being, hee hee, it's a silly little movie where girls get to kiss naked. Not that there's anything wrong with that, or movies about that, and it is just a silly little movie where girls get to kiss naked, but it's also, deep, you know? Back to the story. So, Ikuhara names the studio Be Papas, and the key players are character designer Shinya Hasegawa, scriptwriter Yoji Enokido, and mangaka Chio Saito. In 1997, Saito released a 5-volume manga, and Ikuhara directed a 39-episode anime. Both are called Revolutionary Girl Utena. In 1999, Ikuhara added a film to the series, directing Adolescence of Utena. Each of these branches of the Utena series follows the same general plot. After Utena lost her parents as a child, she hides herself in a coffin beside them, seeing no reason why she should keep living. Even when a mysterious prince pulls her out of this coffin, she isn't revived until she meets another little girl who's suffering, and promises to grow up to be a noble prince who can save her. Now in high school at Atori Academy, Utena becomes trapped in this cycle of dueling the other student council members for the Rose Bride, Anthy. That was her special friend, remember? Spoiler alert, as the story goes along, Utena learns that maybe the Master's tools will never dismantle the Master's house. And maybe, just maybe, fighting in the duels that keep Anthy captive is actually just keeping Anthy captive, reinforcing the idea that Anthy is her property and not a person. I'm making fun of Utena here for not realizing this sooner, but the reality is that this is literally how hegemony works. In the series, these duels are orchestrated by the chairman of their school, Akio. He uses his power to sexually abuse the students, including his younger sister, Anthy. He convinces the students to duel each other by showing them a floating castle in the sky and promising them eternity. Even as we're told from the very first episode that this castle is nothing but a mirage, it takes Utena 38 more episodes to realize that there is no castle. There is no prince. There is no princess. These archetypes we're supposed to aim for are not just improbable, they're unachievable. Nothing but tricks of the light that keep us trapped in these systems of oppression. The castle is projected into the sky by something called the perpetual motion machine. Besides producing this mirage that keeps us fighting each other on the ground, all this machine does is produce empty movement. That empty movement and the perpetual motion machine represent how capitalism operates in our world. That is the revolution, the continual cycle of systemic and personal abuse that Atori Academy depends on. Now, because Anthy has been abused for literally thousands of years, she's been convinced that there's no life or world for her beyond this toxic situation. Over the course of the series, Utena helps Anthy to realize her own autonomy, to realize she does have the power to leave her abusive relationship, that there can be life after trauma. When Anthy breaks out of her role as a princess, and Utena breaks out of her role as prince, they leave Atori together for the outside world. Now, there are a lot of different characters and storylines that I didn't even mention here, as well as unique differences between the movie, the manga, and the show. There are also a lot of different theories about how these three branches of the Utena series all fit together. Personally, I think the movie and the show are the exact same story, the only difference being that the movie is told from Anthy's perspective, whereas the show is told from Utena's. And hold on to your hats here, folks, because I don't just think that the movie is from Anthy's perspective, I think that the movie is actually Anthy's body. But before I get to that, I'm going to explain how the movie's plot in particular relates to Morgan's definition of transfeminism, which is women are people and are an oppressed class, but then adds that all gender dissidents suffer from the patriarchy. In her words, no one gets out of patriarchy alive. Ikuhara symbolizes misogyny, racism, homophobia, transphobia, and other oppressions as coffins that we're trapped in. Not only do these ideologies kill us, but while we're alive, they keep us thinking of our bodies and ourselves as already being dead. We can only escape these coffins when we choose to leave them of our own accord. As we can see from Utena's backstory, being pulled from her coffin as a child by Akio didn't save her, it just kept her subordinated to Akio and to the idea of princehood. On the surface, a girl becoming a prince may look revolutionary, but striving to be the savior for all is just as toxic as wishing to be a damsel in distress. Ultimately, all Utena did was move from one coffin to another. In a last-ditch effort to keep Anthy inside Atori and under his control, Akio says, "You'll have to continue to be princesses back there. It's easy, you just need to be a living corpse." As a prince, he would know it's easy to live as a corpse. Both of the princes in the film, Anthy's Prince Akio and Utena's Prince Toga, are ghosts that haunt the narrative, the school, and their relationships. In the director's commentary for the film, Ikuhara revealed that he played audio recorded at a hospital, underneath the scene where these two princes speak to each other. Death surrounds and stems from these two characters, who both beg their respective princesses to join them in living in the world of the dead. In the scene where Utena remembers that Toga died years ago, sacrificing himself for a princess, she realizes that saviorism was never the answer to their oppression. In his last-ditch effort to keep Utena inside Atori and under his control, Toga says, "I promise to love you until the end of the world." Isn't that enough? What he can't see is that Utena needs someone who will love her beyond the end of this world and into the next. Even though both Toga and Akio are desperate to lure others into their death, neither one of them wanted to die. These coffins of misogyny, racism, homophobia, transphobia, and other oppressions are keeping them captive just as much as Utena and Anthy. I think this is especially apparent when we look at how race operates in the series, and I'm going to return to the post by Fagdeg Friendship. Akio's story is a familiar one to me. The story of a minority trying its hardest to fit into a system of the majority, having to go above and beyond what's expected for the majority race to be accepted, only to be turned on as soon as he's not performing excellence to them anymore. They continue. Let's talk about conformist resistance in Revolutionary Girl Utena. I learned this term in my race policy and law class, and it essentially means resistance through trying to succeed in the system. Utena and Akio both practice conformist resistance in their princely behavior. Akio attempts to succeed as a brown man, but is turned on and causes Anthy harm. Utena attempts to succeed as a woman, but realizes that her conforming is hurting Anthy. The intersection of their struggles, gender and race, is found in Anthy. Intersectionality is essential to understanding Anthy's character. The woman of color is the one at the bottom, always. Akio chooses to continue to leverage his power as a man in the hopes of regaining his princehood, the respect of the majority group. This proves harmful to everyone around him. Utena and Anthy, on the other hand, are able to move from conformist to transformative resistance, understanding oppression and working to change the roots of their oppressive conditions. The most obvious symbol of transformative resistance in Utena is in their clothing. From the very first episode of Utena all the way until the end of the film, clothing is the #1 signifier of gender roles in the series. And of course, the gender roles that these characters stuff themselves into are neither Japanese nor Desi. They're distinctly inspired by Western European, white colonial fashion. As Tumblr user Palms Upturned says, the Rose Bride is a symbol. She's an empty dress that collapses when you look closely and see there's nothing more to it than the trappings. Anthy was never in there. It's literally the costume she wears to play her role. It's the same with Utena, as when she dresses herself in Prince's clothes, all she's doing is binding herself into another set of expectations, committing herself to another endless quest to reach that floating castle in the sky. It isn't until Anthy and Utena escape the system altogether that they can shed themselves of these trappings and let their bodies, their real selves underneath, become the vehicle of their liberation. In the words of Tumblr user Selkie Coded, the roles are fake and empty, the girls inside are real. The clothes are fake, but they are not.
Yeah! Woo! So good! So I'm definitely picking up that, the messages of Adolescence of Utena, they definitely line up with transfeminism. So what?
What do you mean, so what?
I can understand how Utena has a transfeminist reading, but how can something actually be made transfeministly?
You remember when I said that I don't just think this film is from Anthy's perspective? I think this film actually is Anthy's body.
Yes.
It's time to talk about Whole. So what does it actually mean for a film to have a transfeminist method, as opposed to a transfeminist ideology? For me, I think it's related to the editing, to how the edit is perceived as an exertion of bodily autonomy from the film itself, when we can see the edit acting as a kind of rebuttal against or medicine for the ways that the film itself is being made into an object. It's a way of the film to take back its own subjectivity. I think we can see it in Adolescence of Utena in three main ways. That is, through the point of view shots, through the tape holes, and through the climax. Most of this film is shot from an objective point of view. If we were reading a novel, that would be like a third-person perspective. The only times this point of view changes is when the camera shifts into Anthy's perspective. The most significant time this happens is during Anthy's introductory scene, when she notices the rose-crest ring that Utena's holding. Looking from Anthy's eyes, we get this slow-motion shot of a rose petal drifting around Utena, and unlike the flurry of other rose petals that just swirled past them, this one casts a shadow. To understand why it's so important that Anthy sees a shadow here, we need to look back at the history of animation. Although Adolescence of Utena was made on the cusp of the new millennium, at the same time that CGI and 3D animation was really taking off, Utena was made to look like the shoujo animes of decades prior, which were made using all hand-painted cell animation. In that process, the backgrounds were drawn as static images first, and then the characters were drawn on a piece of celluloid paper that was placed on top. Each frame of the show had to be handmade and then photographed and played in quick succession to create the appearance of fluid movement. In an article written by Petrovic et al., they write, "Shadows were used in cell animation even from the very early days, because they anchored the figure to the ground. Without some kind of contact with the background, the characters seemed to float around, walking on air no matter how much weight had been animated into their movements." Even in 2000, when cell animation was largely digital, shadows were still added in manually. Petrovic et al. Note that in the moments where the shadow itself becomes a focal point for the viewer's attention, shadows should still be drawn by hand, because they embody an artistic interpretation of the scene. When Anthy sees Utena with the rose-crest ring, she's realizing with horror that Utena has unknowingly been inducted into a system of oppression that will eventually kill them both. Instead of a living subject, Utena becomes a static object, nothing more than a part of the landscape, an actor in the play they're forced to perform. The one casting the shadow, the falling rose petal, becomes the subject. When the rose petal falls out of frame, it's replaced by Anthy's hand. She tries to get the ring out of Utena's hands before it's not too late. From both the angle of the shot and the use of shadows, the film itself is representing Anthy's urges to escape the narrative. In the scene where Utena and the viewers first learn about Anthy's sexual abuse, Anthy lets Utena see the holes in her body and says, "This is why everyone wants me, the Rose Bride." Under her voice, we hear the sound of an airplane taking off for the castle in the sky behind them, implying that Anthy's body is being used as the vehicle for others to achieve what she describes as eternity, miracles, and everything that glows. Of course, we know that this utopia doesn't exist, but the mere thought that it might is enough to keep everyone in this world captive to the dueling system. Right after we first see the holes in Anthy's body, we cut to a scene where the Shadowplay girls are reviewing their scandalous videotapes, which cover the screen in static. So before I go on, I need to give a little backstory. So in my deepest spell of watching and rewatching Adolescence of Utena, I was also making a short film called Echo. That short film involved a lot of 90s technology like VHS and these big clunky TVs that I would have showing static. Partway through making this film, my prof, Chase Joint, asked me to explain what the static was supposed to mean, and I didn't have an answer. I was too embarrassed to tell him that part of the reason why I was making my film was to try and understand Ikuhara's film. So he was like, okay, well, when you put a VHS in and the screen turns to static, that means that someone has replayed the video so many times that it's actually worn a hole in the tape. And while that was helpful in making my film, more importantly, I was sitting on the other side of the Zoom call going, oh my god, I get what Ikuhara was trying to do now. These bursts of static throughout Adolescence of Utena are not just there for aesthetic. The holes in the tape reflect the holes in Anthy's body. While her holes promise eternity, miracles, and everything that glows, the reality is exactly what the audience sees. Nothing. It is empty movement. In the third act of the film, Utena asks Anthy to come with her to the outside world. Unsure, Anthy hesitates while Utena runs ahead of her and is transformed into a car.
Let's ride. Let's ride. Let's ride.
映画はね、
Let's ride.
車になります。
Lavender Lamborghini, roll up in a blue bikini. Bitches on the beaches looking super cute and freaky. All my friends are princesses, we keep it whipped and creamy. Ice cubes on our tongues because we like to keep it freezy. Lavender Lamborghini, get out on the right side. Chauffeur stayed at home because my girl wanted to ride. Licking laps and tasting plush, I'm feeling so alive. Wanna take it to the highway, come on, let's go for a drive.
In Fandom Musing's video essay on the subject, they explain that in the anime, Akio's car is his ultimate status symbol. Akio is the only character who can afford to buy a car, so it's a symbol of his class. Akio is the only character who's seen as being a true prince, so it's a symbol of his masculinity. Akio is the only character old enough to drive, so it's a symbol of his seniority. Akio sexually abuses the students at Atori Academy in that car, and in several episodes we get dialogue where he talks about the car as if it is his body. To him, wielding his body as a weapon against these students is no different than using his seniority, class, or masculinity to get what he wants from this system. After Akio realizes that the drugs he fed Anthy didn't work and she was actually awake when he was assaulting her, he starts panicking, saying, "I can't find the key. A car without its key is stuck, it goes to rust." Upon realizing that Anthy now knows he's not a prince, Akio realizes he's lost control over her. When Utena turns into a car, Anthy finds the key in her pocket. The key Akio was looking for, the power over Anthy's body, was always hers. But now, for the first time in her life, that power is in her hands. The last arc of the film is quite literally Anthy riding Utena into the new world. Phrased differently, the climax of the film is Anthy's climax. In an interview published the year after the release of Adolescence of Utena, Ikuhara talks about cars and masculinity, saying, "I'm extremely interested in the psychology of men who project themselves into something, or want to become one with something. Because I myself feel fed up with this hobby inclination, I would like to get a different value sense, but it's difficult to escape from the desire for possession, the desire for control. The men who come closest to what I'm imagining are perhaps race car drivers. In the situation when a racer drives super fast, the man and the car become one." The interviewer, film critic Mari Kotani, responds that it feels like in such a situation, instead of thinking, you become one with your body. You move to a place where you are not objectified, a place where you can see yourself. In the final scene of the film, Anthy and Utena become one, allowing Anthy to finally see herself as she is and become a living subject. Writing on the potential of the selfie for queer of color justice, Aria Dean quotes Lorraine Grady. "To name ourselves rather than be named we must first see ourselves. The reason why it's important that this film is Anthy's body is because throughout her life, she's never before been the one behind the camera. Like the binary of prince and princess, her life has always been haunted by the binary of audience and actor. She's always been the one in front of the camera performing. And behind the camera has always been Akio, but also Ikuhara, the rest of the B-Papa's team, and us, the viewers. It's no surprise that the moment of Anthy's liberation is also the moment she frees herself from the narrative, freeing herself from the coffins of misogyny, racism, homophobia, transphobia, and other oppressions also means freeing herself from all of the archetypes and expectations that constrain her. As the film ends, it leaves us knowing that Anthy and Utena are outside the reach of Akio, Ikuhara, and B-Papas. But for many fans, the end of this film is not the end of our story with them. 26 years after the anime's initial release, the fandom has fostered a community that's thriving now more than ever. The Utena Renaissance is upon us, and along with the work of Vana and Yasha over at Empty Movement, I would argue one of the most far-reaching platforms for Utena content is this, the video essay. Knowing how important it is for Anthy's body to be her own at the end of the series, how can we think about fan content giving her a second life? Knowing how the binaries of prince, princess, subject, object, audience, creator are all unstable, how do we think about Ikuhara's role in all of this as just one piece of the puzzle, incomplete without the help of all of these other thinkers and creators? Is there any way you can really see Anthy's body as it is without engaging with others? Is there any way you can understand what I'm saying right now without being an active participant in this story? Wait, did you just...
Utena feels like a black hole sometimes where you can fall into it and never come out and just have your entire life be dedicated to it. And I know multiple people that this has happened to. Sounds like you were in there for a while, or maybe you still are.
I'm in the hole. I don't know whose hole it is. I don't know. But I'm in the hole.
You can just call me Stushi. That's my internet name. My claim to fame is that I made an Utena video that a lot of people liked. Utena is pretty special, not just like to me, but I think it is a very special piece of art. So I first watched it when I was a teenager, which was more than 10 years ago. So it had been a long time between my first watch and then my rewatch during the pandemic. And it really was very different because at the time I hadn't realized that I was a part of the homosexual underground. So watching it after coming to that realization was like, holy shit, this is very, very gay. And there was a lot of gender stuff in there. And as someone who is like, no clue what's going on with their gender right now, this is very enlightening to watch that. I think YouTube as a medium, or any kind of video where you are staring at the camera, makes its editing very obvious. There's so many video essayists who do a similar thing where you could analyze their video essays for hours on end. I mean, I think that, the best person to do it is ContraPoints. I don't think anyone will ever top her. So there's a lot of inspiration there. I think that creators who use what you call non-normative editing are hyper aware of is the fact that they have an audience, the fact that it will be read in a certain way, and that they won't be able to control how it's read. I think that as an audience member, it's a lot of work. You can't passively engage with something like Utena because you will end up getting sometimes the exact opposite understanding of it. It's not something that I, as an audience member, take for granted or take lightly.
When I watch video essays, as a Utena fan, as someone who overanalyzes everything. I'm not watching this to like get the knowledge. I'm like watching this as if like I'm having a conversation with someone. And like in my head, I'm like talking back to the person.
Yeah, I was just thinking about this Twitter post recently I saw that was talking about how books are an inherently consensual form of media, and how, you know, by choosing to open up a book, you're consenting to read it, and the moment that something happens that you don't like, you can just close the book and not continue reading it. So it requires consent by default. And I was just thinking about how that could apply to experimental films, and how by watching a movie, you're not necessarily consenting to the whole experience by just clicking play on a movie. You're watching, you can choose to see it as it is presented, but then with certain films, you are presented with a choice to dive deeper or not. And in that way, it almost feels like with something like Utena, you know, you don't have to go all in and really read into all the aspects of it. You could just watch it at a surface level and get what you get out of it. But at some point, you are entering a consensual relationship with that form of media by choosing to go deeper and by choosing to engage with it on another level.
You know, the guiding thread through so many of Ikuhara's shows, except for Sarazanmai, interestingly enough, is that it's about these stories of these queer women and queer girls escaping out of something, escaping out of this like toxic environment, but it's like their escape out of the toxic environment is also their escape out of the show. Like we don't get to see them in freedom. We don't get to see that, but also it's like, because like their freedom means freedom from our gaze.
Everything about Utena and Utena's editing can be thought of in terms of its framing, because it wants you to think of it as a theater performance and a picture at the same time, and as Plato's cave with the shadow play girls. I think that also lends itself to the idea of what you're thinking about, that we can only see one side, one part of the whole world, and we will never see the outside world, and that is on purpose because we are not meant to. We don't deserve to see the rest, is how I interpret it. Like, we haven't done anything to deserve that.
Yeah. But I wonder even if it's something that you can see. It's the whole idea of Plato's allegory of the cave, and like, if you brought someone out there without it being their own choice, then they would try and kill you, because they would think that all of the like sunlight and you know that was like harming them. When Utena tries to like, you know, forcibly pull her out of her coffin, Anthy stabs her in the back because she thinks of it as being a betrayal, right? And I think that that's really interesting about what that says about the audience then. If like the characters are going and they're seeing the outside world, like it's up to us to make that decision for ourselves, to go and see the outside world, because that's not a choice that the creator can make for us. That's not a choice. That's a choice that we have to do, and we have to see for ourselves. Like, it literally cannot be depicted on screen.
It's exactly that. If we were to see that outside world, it would no longer be what it is. Us simply perceiving it would change it in a way that would destroy it.
In Adolescence of Utena, two characters called the Shadowplay Girls appear throughout the narrative to comment on what Utena and Anthy are going through. We don't learn until the very end of the film after they've escaped Ittori, that these shadow girls were Utena and Anthy all along. Modeled after the stagehands in Japanese theater, Ikuhara describes them as being like anti-directors, working against his vision for a narrative from inside the story. In Plato's cave, they're like the shadows cast on the wall, projecting fantastical images of what the world is, if only the prisoners could escape to see it. The same as when Anthy imagined the shadow cast by the rose petal, these shadow girls were a reflection of Anthy and Utena's desires. As Ikuhara phrased it, they were working against his wishes as director for a straightforward archetypal fairy tale. They cease to exist at the end of the film because Utena and Anthy have reached the outside world, and they no longer need to live through these desires alone.
As Utena says in the Volta of the film, there is no prince. When Ikuhara refuses to show us what that outside world or their futures look like, that's also a refusal for him or his film to play the role of savior. Utena can't pull Anthy from her coffin, just like this film can't pull any of us from ours. If Ikuhara were to show us what that outside worlds look like, that would only create another castle in the sky to strive towards. Instead, this film is daring us to imagine all the possibilities of what we could be, promising that we have always had inside of ourselves, inside of our bodies, the means to access that different world. Both on a story and a craft level, Adolescence of Utena aligns itself with transfeminism, but it becomes a transfeminist text precisely because of the way that it necessitates community. Alone, none of us would be able to understand Utena. Even all of us together for the past 26 years are still asking each other what it all means. That isn't a failure of the film to make itself coherent and digestible. On the contrary, that's what makes Utena so revolutionary, that it demands we engage with its body with curiosity, patience, and a desire to learn from one another. In Emi Koyama's essay, The Transfeminist Manifesto, she writes, "None of us should be expected to reject every oppressive factor in our lives at the same time. It would burn us out and drive us crazy. The sum of our small rebellions combined will destabilize the normative gender system as we know it." At the end of the series, Utena doesn't become a prince because the world doesn't need princes. The world needs friends. The world needs intimacy. The world needs support. That's what Vana told me when I interviewed her and Yasha at Empty Movement about their work archiving Utena. Intimacy, support, friendship, all of these are important themes in the series, but they're also the modes through which we understand the series. Like Stushi said, creators who use non-normative editing are hyper-aware of the fact that they have an audience, and that they have no control over how that audience will respond to their film. Instead of reacting to that with fear and treating the audience like an object that just needs to be pushed and pulled in the right directions to suspend their disbelief, this mindset allows for the audience to be seen as an active part of the filmmaking process. With experimental films, the relationship between creator and audience is not pretending to be hierarchical or static. Experimental films necessitate community from that relationship first. In Adrienne Marie Brown's book, Pleasure Activism, she writes about letting pleasure guide the ways that we activate, organize, and dream of new worlds. When I was talking to Yasha about this idea of pleasure-led activism, she was quiet for a minute, and then asked me if I'd ever thought about how hard it is to really know a person. She asked me, how can you understand somebody without learning every little thing there is to know about them? The way their mind works, the way their skin smells. I guess that's what they mean when they say love, huh? On their website, Vana and Yasha organized the longest-running Utena archive in the English language. Through their Twitter and Discord, they facilitate the largest community of Utena fans in the English language. They're also a married couple who met through their shared love of the series. None of these facts are coincidental. Vana and Yasha approach the relationship
to each other, to community, and to Utena all in the same way. And none of these relationships with and through media would be possible if they thought of the series as a static object.
In a conversation co-authored by Chase Joynt and Jules Roskam, they agree that relationship and reciprocity are crucial to what they call a trans-cinematic method. Roskam says that trans embodiment itself can be thought of as a kind of collaborative practice. The body as I want it must be in collaboration with the body as I have it.
At the beginning of this video, I asked what's possible if we start to think about films as bodies, and what's possible if we start to think about these bodies as subjects instead of objects. What I really mean to ask is, what's possible if we start to think about ourselves, our bodies, as subjects instead of objects? What is possible?
No matter where you are, I swear I'll find you. Wait for me, Utena.